Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Tonight's story is not loud. It doesn't begin with screaming sirens or flashing police lights. It begins in silence. A silence so heavy that even the walls of a small American home seem to hold their breath. A 9-year-old child is dead, and the person standing at the center of this case is the one who was supposed to protect her the most. Her mother. In court, she looks calm, composed, controlled. When the judge asks for her plea, she doesn't hesitate. Not guilty, 2 words. Cold, measured, final. But behind those words lies a story the public barely knows. A story filled with contradictions, hidden behavior, and moments that never made it into headlines. Because this case is not just about a child who died. It's about what happened before that night, what didn't happen after, and what the mother did or didn't do when the world wasn't watching. This is a case where timelines don't match, witness statements quietly change, and a mother's love begins to look unfamiliar. In America, society is built on one belief that is almost sacred: a mother would never intentionally harm her own child. That belief is about to be tested, because investigators didn't just find a body. They found unanswered questions. Why were emergency calls delayed? Why did neighbors hear arguments but no cries for help? Why did the mother's story change, not once but multiple times? And most disturbing of all, why did the child's injuries tell a story completely different from the one her mother told police? This is not a case of sudden violence. This is a slow burn tragedy. A case where warning signs were ignored, where systems failed, and where the truth may have been hidden behind the image of a normal American mom. Tonight, we will walk through this case step by step, not as breaking news, not as a headline, but as a story of a little girl whose voice was never heard, and a mother who insists she is innocent, even as evidence quietly stacks up around her. Stay with me, because what comes next is far darker than what the public was ever told. She was 9 years old enough to tie her own shoes, old enough to read bedtime stories by herself, old enough to understand when something felt wrong. To the outside world, she looked like a normal American child. School photos showed a shy smile. Teachers described her as quiet, polite, and withdrawn. Not a troublemaker, not a problem child, just invisible. She lived with her mother in a modest home, the kind you pass every day without noticing. No broken windows, no police tape, no signs of chaos. Neighbors would later say the same thing again and again. They seemed normal. She was a devoted mom. I never imagined something like this, but behind closed doors, the atmosphere was very different. According to investigators, the house carried a strange emotional weight. No warmth, no playfulness, no traces of a carefree child. The girl's bedroom was almost empty. Few toys, no colorful posters, no messy corners that usually belong to a 9-year-old. It felt controlled. Friends from school later told counselors that she rarely talked about home. When asked about her mother, she would pause, think, then change the subject. One classmate remembered something chilling. The girl once said very casually, "My mom gets angry when I ask too many questions." At the time, no one thought much of it. After all, parents get stressed. Single parents struggle. That's normal. But this mother was different. She kept strict routines, strict rules, strict silence. Neighbors reported frequent late-night arguments, but only one adult voice. No loud crying, no shouting from the child, just doors closing hard, footsteps pacing the floor, and long stretches of silence afterward. Investigators later noted something disturbing. There were no recent photos of the girl on the mother's phone, no birthday plans, no upcoming school activities saved in her calendar, almost as if the child was slowly disappearing from her mother's life long before she disappeared for real. And then there were the injuries. Teachers had noticed bruises before, small ones, always explained away. She fell, she's clumsy, she bruises easily. Mandatory reporters documented it, but nothing escalated. No one pushed hard enough. No one imagined where this road would end. Because on the night everything fell apart, what happened inside that house was not sudden. It was the final chapter of something that had been building for a very long time. And when police finally arrived, they didn't just find a crime scene. They found a story that didn't make sense. That night began like any other quiet weekday in America. No visitors, no celebrations, no noise that would alert anyone outside the house. Just a mother and her 9-year-old daughter inside walls that had learned to keep secrets. According to the mother, the child ate dinner, complained of feeling tired, and went to her room early. But phone data later showed the mother was pacing, making short calls, deleting messages, and moving through the house restlessly for nearly 2 hours. Neighbors would report hearing a dull thud sometime after 10 p.m., not loud enough to be alarming, just heavy enough to be remembered later. The emergency call did not come immediately. It came much later. When the mother finally dialed 911, her voice was steady, almost rehearsed, as she told the dispatcher that her daughter wasn't waking up. No panic, no screaming, no crying, just pauses, long ones. First responders arrived expecting a medical emergency, but what they found didn't match the story. The child was already cold. Her body showed signs that death had occurred well before the call. There were marks that looked old and new at the same time, layered injuries that told investigators this wasn't a single moment of harm, but a pattern. When officers gently asked the mother to walk them through the night again, her timeline shifted by minutes, then by hours. Small changes at first, then bigger ones. She said she checked on the child, then said she didn't. She said the girl was breathing, then said she wasn't sure. Each version sounded calm, but none of them aligned with the physical evidence in the room, and that was the moment detectives realized this case was not about what happened that night. It was about what the mother was trying to hide. The crime scene did not scream violence, and that was exactly what unsettled investigators the most, because true domestic crimes rarely look chaotic. The child lay neatly on the bed, blankets pulled up too carefully, her hair brushed as if someone had tried to erase what came before. There was no sign of a struggle in the room, no overturned furniture, no broken objects, but the medical examiner would later explain that this kind of order often points to control, not calm. Under the soft bedroom light, faint marks were visible on the child's arms and torso, some already healing, others disturbingly fresh, injuries at different stages that immediately ruled out an accident. The autopsy revealed internal trauma that could not have come from a simple fall, bruising deep beneath the skin, pressure marks consistent with force, and a cause of death that told a brutal truth the mother's story could not survive. This was not sudden illness. This was not an unforeseeable tragedy. This was homicide. Time of death estimates showed the child had been gone long before the emergency call, meaning precious minutes, possibly hours, were lost while the mother did nothing. When detectives confronted her with these findings, she didn't break down. She didn't ask questions. She didn't cry for her daughter. Instead, she asked one thing, quietly and precisely, whether she needed a lawyer. In that moment, the case shifted from uncertainty to intent, and investigators began to look backward, digging into the mother's past, her mental state, her relationships, and the pattern of control that now seemed impossible to ignore. As detectives pulled apart the mother's life, a pattern began to surface that had never been visible from the outside, because in America, danger often hides behind routine. She had no violent criminal record, no history that would raise immediate alarms, but there were traces, small, overlooked signs scattered across years. Former friends described her as intensely controlling, someone who needed everything to happen her way, especially inside her home. She struggled with anger but expressed it quietly, through punishment, silence, and isolation rather than open rage. School records showed she resisted outside involvement, missed parent meetings, declined counseling offers, and reacted defensively whenever teachers raised concerns about her daughter's emotional withdrawal. Child Protective Services had received at least one anonymous call months earlier, but without visible proof or cooperation, the case was closed. Text messages recovered from her phone revealed resentment, exhaustion, and disturbing frustration about motherhood, messages sent to no one in particular, words typed and erased again and again. Friends recalled her saying the child was too difficult, too sensitive, always watching, comments that now sounded less like stress and more like dehumanization. Psychologists later noted that this emotional distancing often precedes physical harm, especially when a caregiver begins to see a child not as a person, but as a burden. And still, no one stepped in. The system moved on, until it was too late. When investigators moved beyond the house and into the digital trail, the case took a far more disturbing turn, because phones remember what people try to forget. The mother's search history, partially recovered despite multiple deletions, showed late-night queries about child discipline laws, accidental death explanations, and how long it takes for a body to cool after death. These searches were not clustered in a moment of panic. They were spread across weeks, quietly suggesting preparation rather than fear. Location data placed her phone moving through the house during the window when the child was already estimated to be unresponsive, contradicting her claim that she had been asleep. Deleted messages revealed drafts never sent, sentences that read like rehearsals, describing scenarios where a child doesn't wake up and no one notices until morning. Prosecutors would later argue that these were not the thoughts of a grieving mother, but of someone trying to build a story before reality caught up. Even more unsettling was a note found saved in her phone, not a confession, not a plan, but a list of reminders. Stay calm, keep answers short, ask for a lawyer. To detectives, it felt like a script written for the worst night of her life, except the child was not the focus, survival was. And as this evidence stacked up quietly behind the scenes, the public still believed this was a tragic accident, unaware that the foundation for a murder charge was already being laid, piece by invisible piece. The arrest did not happen immediately, and that delay would later haunt the case, because the mother had time to prepare herself, to rehearse, to harden. When detectives finally brought her in for formal questioning, the interrogation room felt eerily calm. She sat straight, hands folded, eyes dry. For hours, she answered questions with careful neutrality, repeating the same phrases again and again, as if consistency could replace truth. But cracks began to form when investigators stopped asking about the night itself and started asking about the weeks before it. Her breathing changed. Her jaw tightened. She corrected detectives on small, unnecessary details, behaviors experts recognize as control slipping. When shown photos of the injuries, she looked away, not in pain, but in irritation, and said the marks must have been from discipline that got misunderstood. That single sentence changed everything. Because discipline does not cause layered trauma. Discipline does not explain internal injuries. Discipline does not delay emergency calls. For the first time, her voice rose. Not in grief, in anger. She accused the police of targeting her, of twisting facts, of trying to steal her child even after death. And in that moment, the mask fell just enough for detectives to see what had been hiding underneath, not a broken mother, but someone furious that control had finally been taken away. When formal charges were finally filed, the courtroom atmosphere felt heavy in a way that words could not fully explain, because this was not a spectacle, it was a reckoning. The charge was clear and devastating, murder of a child, and as the mother stood before the judge, there was no visible reaction on her face, no collapse, no disbelief, just a controlled stillness that unsettled everyone watching. When asked to enter her plea, she spoke calmly, almost mechanically, saying, "Not guilty," as if the words had been practiced long before they were needed. Psychologists later explained that such a plea is not always about innocence, but about power, the refusal to surrender control even when the narrative has turned against you. In the gallery, there were no family members sitting beside her, no quiet support, only empty space that spoke louder than any accusation. Prosecutors outlined a case built on pattern rather than impulse, evidence that suggested intent formed over time, while the defense leaned heavily on doubt, mental stress, and the idea that motherhood under pressure can distort perception. But the plea itself sent a message to the public. This would not be a case resolved by emotion. It would be fought inch by inch, detail by detail, while the child at the center of it all remained voiceless, reduced to evidence, photographs, and timelines that could never explain what it felt like to live inside that house. As the case entered the public eye, America reacted the way it always does when motherhood and murder collide, with division. News outlets framed the story carefully at first, using words like alleged and tragic, while flashing childhood photos that made the loss feel unreal. Social media split into two camps almost overnight. Some people saw a monster hiding behind a calm face, pointing to the injuries, the delayed call, the coldness. Others saw a stressed, overwhelmed single mother crushed by a system that offers judgment faster than help. True crime forums dissected every court appearance, every blink, every expression, reading guilt into her posture or innocence into her silence. The defense team leaned into this uncertainty, reminding the public that not all mothers grieve the same way, that shock can look like calm, that trauma can mute emotion. But prosecutors knew public sympathy could be dangerous, so they quietly released carefully chosen details, the timeline gaps, the layered injuries, the digital searches, just enough to shift the narrative without revealing everything. Slowly, the tone changed. Headlines grew sharper. Comment sections grew darker. And beneath the noise, one uncomfortable question kept resurfacing. If this had been a stranger instead of a mother, would there still be doubt at all? Behind the scenes, prosecutors were building their case with a level of restraint that looked almost passive to the public, but in reality, it was calculated and deliberate. They understood that juries hesitate when a mother is accused, so they avoided emotional language and focused instead on patterns that could not be explained away. Expert witnesses were lined up quietly, forensic pathologists who would explain how the injuries formed over time, psychologists who would testify about control-based parenting, and digital analysts ready to walk the jury through deleted searches minute by minute. One piece of evidence remained intentionally hidden until trial: a reconstructed timeline showing that the child was likely unconscious while the mother moved through the house, cleaned surfaces, and delayed help. This was not chaos. This was choice. The defense, meanwhile, prepared to challenge every assumption, suggesting alternative causes, questioning the reliability of time-of-death estimates, and arguing that stress can fracture memory. But prosecutors believed the strongest evidence was not a single act. It was the absence of urgency, the lack of instinct, the silence where panic should have been. And as jury selection approached, both sides knew this case would not be decided by one shocking moment, but by whether 12 strangers could accept a truth that felt almost unbearable: that sometimes the greatest danger to a child is the person the world trusts the most. The trial unfolded slowly, each day peeling back another layer of a life that had been carefully hidden, and the courtroom grew quieter as witnesses took the stand. Teachers spoke first, their voices steady but strained as they described a child who flinched at sudden sounds, who avoided eye contact, who once asked if staying late at school was allowed. Medical experts followed, explaining in precise, unemotional language how the injuries could not have happened all at once, how healing bruises sat beside fresh trauma, how the body told a story that memory could not erase. Then came the digital analyst, walking the jury through timestamps and movements, showing how the mother's phone was active while the child lay unresponsive. But the moment that froze the room came from an unexpected witness, a neighbor, who recalled hearing a single sentence through an open window weeks before the death, spoken by an adult voice, low and sharp: "You're making me do this." The defense objected immediately, but the damage was done. The room fell silent, not with shock, but with recognition, as if everyone understood at once that this case was never about an accident, but about a long erosion of empathy that finally crossed a line. The defense knew they could not erase the evidence, so they focused instead on reshaping it, carefully constructing doubt piece by piece. They questioned the reliability of forensic timelines, suggesting margins of error wide enough to let uncertainty breathe. They brought in their own experts, professionals who spoke about stress, dissociation, and how trauma can fracture perception, arguing that the mother may not have understood the severity of the situation until it was too late. They emphasized her lack of prior convictions, her isolation, her exhaustion, painting a portrait of a woman overwhelmed rather than malicious. Every emotional gap was reframed as shock. Every inconsistency was labeled confusion. They reminded the jury again and again that calm does not equal guilt, that not all grief looks the same. But beneath these arguments ran a quieter strategy, shifting focus away from the child and toward the mother's inner world, asking jurors to empathize before they evaluated. Prosecutors watched closely, knowing this was the most dangerous phase of the trial, because doubt does not need to be true, it only needs to feel possible. When closing arguments began, the courtroom felt different, heavier, as if everyone understood that the story was about to be locked into a final shape. The prosecution did not raise their voice. They did not appeal to emotion. Instead, they walked the jury back through the timeline one last time, slowly, deliberately, showing how every decision the mother made narrowed the child's chances of survival. They spoke about choices: the choice to control rather than comfort, the choice to discipline rather than protect, the choice to wait instead of calling for help. Then came the detail the public had never heard before: a brief window, minutes long, where medical experts believed the child could still have been saved if emergency services had been called immediately. The mother had been awake. Her phone had been active. Help was possible, and it was not sought. The prosecutor paused, letting that reality settle, before saying quietly that this case was not about one moment of rage, but about a gradual loss of empathy that turned a child into a problem to be managed rather than a life to be protected. No accusations, no labels, just facts placed side by side until the conclusion became unavoidable. When the jury was sent out to deliberate, the courtroom emptied into a tense, uneasy quiet, the kind that settles when there is nothing left to say and everything left to decide. Outside, cameras waited, commentators speculated, and the public tried to read meaning into every passing hour. Inside the jury room, the discussion was slow and methodical, not emotional, not dramatic. Jurors revisited timelines, replayed testimony, argued over minutes and intent, over whether inaction could carry the same weight as action. Some struggled with the idea that a mother could choose not to save her child. Others struggled with the idea that the evidence allowed any other explanation. Hours stretched on. Night fell, and with every delay, the truth became harder to escape. This was not a case balanced on a single doubt, but on whether society was ready to accept a reality that felt deeply uncomfortable. By the time the jury finally signaled they had reached a decision, the tension was no longer about the verdict itself, but about what that verdict would say about trust, responsibility, and the quiet spaces where harm is allowed to grow. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the room stood still, and in that silence the verdict landed with a weight that felt irreversible. Guilty, not because of one explosive moment, but because of everything that came before and everything that did not happen when it mattered most. The mother showed little reaction as the words were read, her face controlled, unreadable, as if the outcome had already been accepted long ago. Sentencing would come later, but the truth had already settled. The system had finally named what the evidence had been saying all along. In the weeks that followed, the house was emptied, the neighborhood moved on, and the media found new stories, but the child's absence remained permanent. No appeals could rewrite the timeline. No explanations could give back the minutes that were lost. This case became a quiet warning in America's criminal history, not about monsters hiding in shadows, but about harm that grows in ordinary places, behind closed doors, disguised as discipline, control, and silence. And as this story fades from headlines, it leaves behind a question that never truly goes away. How many warning signs are ignored before a tragedy becomes undeniable? If this story made you think, if it made you pause, share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more stories where the truth lives in the details, and silence speaks the loudest.